He walked in without a word, a Japanese millionaire whose silence rattled the wealthy more than any demand could, because no one in the room understood him, and humiliation was seconds away. The chandeliers of Lou Bernardine dripped light like molten gold, spilling across white-clothed tables and crystal flutes that chimed faintly whenever a hand gestured too quickly. This was the kind of room where privilege was not only served, it was performed, each laugh rehearsed, each fork raised with ceremony. Bankers dissected futures over Burgundy older than some of their marriages. Socialites fanned themselves with menus they had no need to read. The night was already a theater, and yet everything shifted the moment he entered. Through the tall oak doors came a man who moved as though time itself yielded for him. Hiroshi Takahashi did not rush. He did not bend to the urgency that governed the rest of the room. He carried silence like a crown, his charcoal suit a second skin that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Silver threaded through his dark hair, bound neatly, not a strand out of place. His shoes made no sound against the marble floor, though somehow their quiet command echoed louder than any conversation. Heads turned like compass needles toward him. Whispers shot through the dining hall with the voltage of rumor. Investor? Diplomat? Some whispered gangster, their thrill sharpened by fear. Others murmured kingmaker, for his composure had that unmistakable weight, the kind of man who could decide the fate of fortunes with a nod. The hostess nearly dropped her reservation tablet. Senators, athletes, heirs. She had seated them all. None had made her straighten her posture twice before speaking. Takahashi inclined his head slightly as she stammered through a greeting. When he spoke, his words flowed in Japanese, soft consonants rippling like silk through the still air. Not a single syllable was understood. The hostess froze, smiled too brightly, and excused herself with the practiced grace of retreat. Within moments, Richard Carroll, owner of Lou Bernardine, appeared at her side. His charm switched on like a spotlight, a booming welcome masking the nervous stammer beneath. Yet when Takahashi answered, still in his own tongue, the rhythm of his words steady and patient, Kirill's smile faltered. He glanced over his shoulder, desperate. Servers hovered like moths to flame. French? Italian? Spanish? Kirill demanded in low whispers, as though summoning languages could save him. Blank stares met his panic. The millionaire's composure remained unbroken, but there was a subtle shift in the set of his shoulders, a tightening at the edges of patience. He gestured once to the menu, then again, asking the simplest of things. Still, no one understood. The elite diners nearby began to smirk, their amusement spreading like wine spilled across linen. Imagine, someone muttered just loud enough, a place like this without a single Japanese speaker. Another laughed behind a jeweled hand. To them, this was entertainment, a crack in the restaurant's polished perfection. From the kitchen doors, Naomi Williams emerged with her tray balanced steady on one arm, her body moving with the precision of someone who had no margin for error. Her uniform was immaculate, her bun so tight it pulled at her temples, each detail arranged to erase any excuse for criticism. For 6 years she had learned to glide unseen through these rooms, as invisible as the marble polish beneath her feet. Yet she felt the shift in the air immediately, the tension that prickled across the dining hall like static before a storm. She set a glass down, poured water with perfect stillness, and glanced toward table 7. There he sat, hands folded neatly, gaze heavy but unreadable. Up close, Naomi noticed the fine lines around his eyes, the kind carved by years of restraint rather than laughter. There was something in him beyond wealth, something heavier, shadowed, the kind of sorrow that never leaves but waits, patient as stone. Takahashi spoke again, his voice calm, his tone now carrying the soft insistence of a question. Naomi caught none of it, only the cadence, the way each word seemed weighted with expectation. Kirill hovered at her shoulder, his whisper sharp. Figure it out. She knew she couldn't. None of them could. At the nearby tables, the laughter sharpened. Diners leaned back to watch the failure unfold, savoring the rare sight of prestige cracking under its own performance. The chandelier light caught their wine glasses, sparkling in cruel applause. Takahashi's gaze swept the room once, his expression unchanging, but Naomi recognized it. It was the look of someone beginning to realize he did not belong, that his presence here was unwelcome. And as his hand moved toward his coat, the first gesture of departure, the silence of the dining room pressed heavier. The moment teetered at the edge of collapse, prestige threatened, humiliation inevitable. All it would take was a single step toward the door, and the night would end in ruin. The stage was set, the tension drawn taut, and Naomi, carrying the weight of both trays and motherhood, felt it snap inside her chest like the intake of a held breath. The room had reached its breaking point. Forks hovered mid-air, conversations cut themselves short. and every gaze turned toward the man at table 7 as he rose slowly from his chair. His hand slid through the sleeve of his coat, not hurried, not clumsy, measured, deliberate. It was the kind of motion that carried finality, the kind that announced silently, "I do not need this place." Richard Corral nearly tripped over his own polished shoes as he scrambled forward. "Please, sir, one moment," he begged, his voice strained with a nervous cheer that fooled no one. His hands fluttered like anxious birds as he gestured toward the kitchen, toward the staff, toward anything that might stop the guest from leaving. "We can find a translator, we can—" But Takahashi's eyes had cooled, and though his expression remained unreadable, the truth pulsed like thunder under the silence. This establishment had failed him. Naomi, frozen by the pass-through, gripped her tray until her knuckles whitened. She knew what came next. The diners would laugh louder. The failure would be whispered across the city. Carol's fury would fall on the staff like storm hail. Hours cut, punishments delivered quietly but mercilessly. And her daughter, her reason for enduring all of this, needed her job to survive. The coat was nearly over his shoulders when a small, clear voice cut through the hush. "Mommy." Naomi's heart stumbled. She turned, horrified, to see Isla standing at the edge of the kitchen doors, her backpack still on, braids catching the chandelier light. Mrs. Patterson was nowhere in sight. Somehow her daughter had crossed into this forbidden world, a child's innocence colliding with the razor-sharp formality of Lou Bernardine. "Isla, baby, you can't be here." Naomi's whisper was frantic, her eyes darting to Kareel, who was already flushing purple. But Isla wasn't looking at her mother. Her wide eyes were fixed on the man in the gray suit. The millionaire's movement slowed, his hand pausing on the collar of his coat. For the first time, his gaze softened, curiosity replacing disinterest. And then, impossibly, Isla bowed. Not the clumsy dip of a child imitating cartoons, but a precise angle of respect, the kind only someone taught with care could execute. The room gasped as one. She straightened, lifted her chin, and spoke in a voice clear enough to carry to every table. "Konbanwa go rano no okyaku-sama. Kyo no supesharu menu o okiki ni narimasu ka?" The words glided across the silence like water breaking stone. "Good evening, honored guest. Would you like to hear tonight's special selections?" Time fractured, forks lowered, wine glasses stopped trembling mid-sip, even the ever-clattering kitchen stilled. Takahashi froze, his expression unreadable for one long heartbeat. Then his eyes widened with something none of the wealthy patrons had seen all night, astonishment, followed by wonder. "You speak Japanese?" he asked, his voice low, careful in his own language. Isla nodded with shy pride. "Yes, sir. My neighbor, Mr. Ito, teaches me every day. He says I have a good ear. Would you like to sit again? The fish tonight is very fresh. They flew it in from Boston this morning." Her tiny sneakers squeaked softly against the marble as she took a step closer, fearless in a room that devoured courage for sport. Naomi's pulse roared in her ears. The rules were shattered. Children did not belong here. But in that breathless pause, as the chandelier light bent across silverware and diamonds, the rules didn't matter. The unthinkable had happened. The entire room's hierarchy, its layers of power and pretense, had been overturned by the voice of a 7-year-old child. And the Japanese millionaire, whose silence had unsettled titans and whose grief had hollowed his life, slowly set his coat back on the chair, his lips curved, barely but unmistakably, into a smile. The humiliation that had hung in the air like a blade dissolved. Something else took its place, anticipation, dangerous and electric. Because now the story was no longer about a restaurant's failure. It was about what this little girl might say next, and what secrets the unshaken millionaire might finally reveal. The silence did not break so much as it shifted, like a tide pulling back before a wave. Every eye fixed on the table where a child now sat across from a man who could buy and sell their lives without blinking. The millionaire leaned forward, elbows lightly resting on the tablecloth, his gaze sharp but softened with something that looked startlingly close to relief. "Tell me your name," he asked in Japanese, his voice low, careful, as though testing whether this fragile bridge could hold. "My name is Isla Williams," she replied, her small hands folded neatly on the edge of the table. Her pronunciation rang crisp, innocent yet precise. "This is my mommy. She works here." She gestured proudly toward Naomi, who stood frozen with a tray pressed to her chest, her pulse pounding loud enough she swore the chandeliers could hear it. A murmur rippled across the dining room. Waiters who had been whispering now stood stiff as soldiers. Patrons craned their necks, hungry for scandal, for the spectacle of a child daring to intrude on their world of glass and silver. But Takahashi only nodded slowly, repeating her name as if committing it to memory. Miss Williams, he said in English now, clear and resonant, the shock of it striking through the room like lightning. His command of the language was flawless. The realization shattered every assumption, every cruel whisper uttered when they thought him deaf to their mockery. I am honored to meet you. Gasps broke across the tables. Patricia Whitfield dropped her spoon, the clink ringing too loud. Marcus, her husband, muttered, He speaks English? Like a man betrayed by gravity. But Takahashi's attention had narrowed, drawn entirely to Ila. Switching back to Japanese, he asked gently, Do you study every day? Her eyes brightened. Yes, sir. Mr. Ito, our neighbor, teaches me. He says languages are bridges. If you know them, you can cross anywhere. She leaned closer, her little braids brushing her shoulders. Are you far from home? A shadow passed over his face. For a moment, silence threatened again, but this silence was different, heavy, personal, not the void of misunderstanding, but the gravity of memory. Yes, he said finally, farther than you know. Naomi's throat tightened. She had never heard a child's question pull so much weight from a man's chest. She wanted to rush forward, to shield her daughter from the secrets now rising between them, but she couldn't move. Her daughter wasn't afraid. She was building a bridge plank by plank, word by word. James, the head waiter, shifted uneasily at Naomi's side. This is a disaster, he hissed. He's entertaining a server's child at table 7. Cariel will... But before he could finish, Takahashi Rayai set a hand, silencing even whispers. He turned to Isla again. Tell me, he asked, what would you recommend? The room held its breath as Isla scanned the menu, her lips moving silently as she deciphered the French. The duck is very good. Mommy says the chef's best dish is the halibut, but you don't like cream sauces, do you? She asked in Japanese, tilting her head curiously. The millionaire blinked. Surprise softened into laughter, deep, rich, unrestrained. He actually laughed. You are correct, he said. I do not. The diners stiffened at the sound. Some were scandalized. This man had ignored them all night, yet a child's words brought him joy. Others leaned forward, compelled despite themselves. Naomi felt heat burn behind her eyes. Her daughter had not only broken the silence, she had made the most powerful man in the room laugh. And with each passing exchange, the tension shifted. The whispers no longer mocked. They waited. They listened. Because this wasn't just dinner anymore. It was revelation, unfolding one translated word at a time. But as Naomi watched, another emotion took root beneath her awe. Fear. Because the higher this moment lifted them, the harder the fall would be when Cariel decided to strike back. And Naomi knew with bone-deep certainty he would. The laughter that had slipped from Hiroshi Takahashi's lips seemed to ripple through the entire restaurant, unsettling the brittle scaffolding of formality on which Lou Bernardine prided itself. But as quickly as it came, it ebbed, leaving behind a silence charged with something raw, more dangerous. His gaze lingered on Isla, who sat across from him with the unflinching honesty only a child possessed. She leaned forward, her little hands folded primly, but her eyes, wide, curious, unafraid, searched him with a depth that made Naomi's stomach twist. The child asked another question in careful Japanese, her tone gentle. Do you miss home? The words fell into the quiet like stones breaking the surface of water. Takahashi's composure shifted, his lips parted slightly as if to answer, but no sound came. His hand tightened imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. Naomi, watching from the side, felt her breath catch. There was something in his stillness now, something different from the serene patience he'd carried all evening. This was not the silence of restraint. This was silence breaking. Finally he spoke. Not with the polished cadence of business, nor the polite phrases of dining etiquette. His voice was lower, rougher, pulled from somewhere deeper. I had a daughter, he said in Japanese. Her name was Aiko. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Ila tilted her head, her braids swinging softly. Aiko, she repeated carefully, almost reverently. It means beloved child, right? Takahashi's eyes flickered. For the first time all night, his mask fractured completely. Yes, beloved child. She was about your age when... His voice faltered, and for a heartbeat the room became unbearably intimate, as if every chandelier, every marble tile, every linen-draped table leaned closer to listen. When a drunk driver took her from me, she would have been 17 now. Gasps rustled across the room, forks clattered against porcelain. A few diners shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement shriveling under the weight of tragedy. Naomi felt her chest constrict. Her first instinct was to shield Ila, to whisk her away from the heaviness of this confession, but her daughter didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned closer, her small voice steady. I'm sorry, that's really sad. The simplicity of it cracked something open in Takahashi. He did not weep, but the grief that poured into his eyes was sharper than any tears. His hand trembled slightly as he set down his glass. She played violin. She spoke 3 languages by the time she was 6. I thought I had protected her. All the money, all the care, but in the end, it did not matter. 30 seconds of another man's choice, and she was gone. The room's power shifted. Those who had laughed now sat stone-faced, trapped in the reflection of their own smallness. Even Patricia Whitfield, who moments before had scoffed at Isla's presence, lowered her gaze, her lips pressed thin. Naomi pressed her hand against her tray, grounding herself. She saw the fracture lines running through this man, not the billionaire, not the myth, but a father, hollowed by loss, and she saw her daughter leaning into that fracture, unafraid. "You know," Isla said softly, her Japanese careful, deliberate, "we could write her letters. Mr. Ito says in Japan you can send letters to people who are gone. We could tell her about you, about tonight." For the first time, the unflinching weight in Takahashi's gaze softened into something vulnerable. He stared at her as though she had spoken an incantation, a bridge built between the living and the lost. Slowly he nodded. "A letter. Aiko would have liked that." The murmurs started again, but different now, uneasy, almost ashamed. Diners shifted, eyes darting anywhere but toward the table where grief and innocence mingled. The performance of wealth had collapsed. What remained was something no diamond or glass could distract from. Naomi felt her throat ache. She had spent her life being unseen, but tonight, her daughter's voice had pulled them both into view. The power in that terrified her as much as it awed her, because she knew in this city, power always demanded a price. And as she watched Kirill's jaw tighten across the room, his forced smile cracking into something ugly, Naomi realized the reckoning was coming. The question was no longer if, but when. And the answer would decide not just her job, but the fragile bridge her daughter had built out of nothing but courage, grief, and words. The spell of grief and innocence was fragile, trembling like a candle in the wind. And that was when Richard Carroll decided to strike. The restaurant owner's face, normally a mask of charm, had curdled into something meaner. He moved forward, his smile stretched so tight it looked painful, and spoke loud enough for every table to hear. "This has gone quite far enough," he said, gesturing toward Isla with a sweeping hand as though brushing away a fly. "Lou Bernardine has standards. We cannot have a server's child. She stays." The words cut across the air like a blade. They came not from Naomi, trembling by the service station, but from Hiroshi Takahashi himself. His voice, calm all night, now carried the low iron weight of command. Every head snapped toward him. Kirill froze mid-step, his hand still hovering, his mouth hanging open like a stage actor who'd forgotten his lines. The chandelier light trembled on his sweat. "Mr. Takahashi," he stammered, his voice suddenly small. "Surely you understand this is irregular. Do you know what regular means, where I come from?" Takahashi's English was flawless, smooth, devastating in its clarity. The reveal sent a shockwave through the dining room. Diners gasped. Some clutched pearls or adjusted ties as the truth burned through them. The man they'd dismissed, whispered about, mocked for not speaking their language, had understood everything, every sneer, every joke, every careless cruelty. "You called me a test," he continued, his gaze sweeping the tables. "You called me new money. You questioned if I even knew which fork to use. Do you know what I heard?" His eyes hardened, the steel within finally revealed. "I heard a room so proud of its polish that it mistook arrogance for excellence, a room that believed humiliation was entertainment." Patricia Whitfield turned red, muttering something about misinterpretation, but her husband's silence betrayed the truth. Naomi's chest clenched, her whole body shook, not from fear, but from the sudden possibility that the invisible had become visible, that dignity had finally been named aloud in a place that thrived on denying it. Kirill tried to recover. He spread his arms, performing for the guests, his words desperate. "Mr. Takahashi, this child has no training. Surely you see how dangerous it is to let her play interpreter at such a critical table. What if she mistranslates? What if—" "She translated more than your staff could," Takahashi snapped, his tone cutting now, sharp enough to slice the silence. "She translated sincerity, something this establishment cannot seem to manage." Gasps rippled across the dining hall, but Takahashi wasn't finished. He turned to Naomi and for the first time all evening addressed her directly. "Why did you let her speak?" The question hit like a challenge, heavy and unflinching. Naomi's tray shook in her hands, and for a second she wanted to disappear, to shrink back into invisibility, but Isla's wide eyes were on her, trusting, depending. Her voice trembled at first but steadied as the words came. Because you were alone, she said, and I know what that feels like, because kindness shouldn't depend on someone's bank account, and because she's my daughter, I couldn't ask her to stay silent when she knew how to help. The admission rolled through the room like thunder. Diners shifted in their chairs, some unable to meet her eyes. Others watched with the hungry fascination of those witnessing a world tilt. Takahashi studied her in silence, his gaze deep, searching. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. "You were right," he said softly. "And she was braver than all of you combined." The weight of his judgment hung over every table, crushing the pretense of elegance. Kirill sputtered again, grasping at scraps. "Mr. Takahashi, surely this display cannot represent the standards of international business. Allow me to move you to a private room." "I will stay exactly where I am," Takahashi replied. His calm was gone now, replaced with something harder, more dangerous. "Because tonight is not about your food, or your chandeliers, or your standards. Tonight is about truth, and truth has no need for velvet ropes." The diners leaned in, the air thick with anticipation. The storm had broken, and everyone knew something irreversible was coming. Naomi's pulse raced as she realized what this meant. Takahashi was no longer just a guest. He was about to dismantle everything Lou Bernardine stood for, piece by gilded piece. And the wreckage, she and her daughter might either be destroyed or reborn. The room braced itself. The humiliation had ended. The reckoning had begun. The dining room seemed to tilt under the weight of silence. Every guest sat riveted, their faces caught between disbelief and dread, as if the glittering chandeliers above had transformed into floodlights, exposing truths too long ignored. Kirill's smile had collapsed into something brittle, a mask cracking in real time. Naomi stood near the service station, every nerve taut, her daughter's small silhouette still steady at the center of the storm. Then Hiroshi Takahashi rose, not abruptly. He didn't need drama. His movements were deliberate, controlled, each gesture carrying the gravity of inevitability. The scrape of his chair against the marble floor was louder than any speech Carol had rehearsed in his lifetime. "I came here tonight," he began, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. "Not to sample wine or taste your chef's proudest dish. I came to test something far more important." His eyes swept the tables, pinning each glittering patron in place. "Your character." Gasps fluttered like startled birds. The words cut deeper than any insult because they forced every person in that room to relive what they had said, what they had laughed at when they thought he could not understand. Kirill surged forward, desperation cracking through his carefully cultivated authority. "This is outrageous. You deceived us. You cannot judge an establishment on a single misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Takahashi's calm fractured, his tone sharpened to steel. "I understood every word. I listened as you mocked me for being new money, as you questioned whether I belonged in this room. I watched you measure people's worth not by their dignity, but by their accent, their uniform, their skin." The diners recoiled. Some stared down at their plates, cheeks burning. Others shifted uneasily, trying to slip into invisibility the way Naomi had done her entire career. But there was no hiding now. Naomi felt the heat rise in her chest. She wanted to breathe, to step back, to protect her daughter from the fire, but Isla sat firm, her small hands folded, her eyes shining with a strange mix of innocence and defiance. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Takahashi turned to her, and for a moment his gaze softened. "This child," he said, his voice thickening with emotion, "bridged the gap no one else could. She spoke to me not with polish, but with sincerity. She reminded me of what I lost, and of what I still might build." He looked back at the room. "That is what true hospitality means. Not chandeliers, not price tags, not exclusion masquerading as standards." Kirill sputtered, his face purple with rage. "This is slander. My restaurant is the finest in this city. These accusations, your restaurant," Takahashi cut in, "is worth 14.7 million on the open market. Do you know what that is to me?" He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and laid it flat on the table, screen glowing. "Pocket change." The words detonated in the air. A shiver rippled through the diners. Kirill's knees buckled as if the marble itself had betrayed him. "I could buy this place tonight," Takahashi continued, his voice soft, lethal. "Turn it into a school, a community center, something useful, instead of a stage for arrogance." He paused, letting the weight of his threat sink in. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled out a small ivory business card and placed it in front of Naomi. The card looked absurdly fragile, like it couldn't possibly carry the future it promised. Naomi stared at it, her breath locked in her chest. "I offer you a position," Takahashi said, this time speaking only to her. "Not because I pity you, but because you have shown the kind of strength money cannot buy. You raised a daughter who builds bridges out of words, who carries more grace at 7 than this room has shown in decades. You deserve more than invisibility. Will you take it?" Naomi's throat burned. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, the weight of judgment pressing down, but none of it mattered. The only eyes she saw were Isla's, wide and hopeful. "Yes," she whispered. "For her, yes." A murmur tore through the dining hall, a mixture of applause, outrage, disbelief. Some diners clapped hesitantly, others hissed their disapproval, but the tide had shifted. The spectacle had turned. Kirill staggered forward, his voice breaking. "You can't do this! This is my house. These are my standards." Takahashi turned, his final words cold as ice. "Then your standards are broken." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that remakes a room. He bent down to Isla, lowering himself to her height. In Japanese, so that only she and her mother truly understood, he said, "You are already a bridge. Never let anyone convince you otherwise." And then he straightened, slipped on his coat with the same deliberate grace, and walked out through the oak doors, leaving behind a restaurant in ruins and 2 lives forever changed. Naomi clutched the card to her chest, her daughter's small hand clasped in hers. For the first time in years, she felt the faint but undeniable pulse of power. Not the power of money or status, but the power of being seen. The chandeliers still glittered overhead, but it was the little girl's voice, not their shine, that lit the room now. The night that began as humiliation had ended as revelation, and nothing, not Carol, not the sneers, not the so-called standards, would ever be the same again.